Marcy Darnovsky, Executive Director, Center for Genetics and Society. Oh, I'm so sorry. You guys, sorry, the panel has agency, so what did you decide to do? You're doing a round table. You have slides. I have the slides. Okay. Yeah. Great.
Very good. Yes. Like everybody. There will be extra paper. I'll take one more.
Okay, so this panel has structured itself, and the participants are, as I said, Marcy Darnovsky, Executive Director, Center for Genetics and Society, Alondra Nelson, the President, Social Science Research Council, Osagie, Bioethics and Medicine from Berkeley, and Aaron Panofsky, Sociology of Science, UCLA Institute for Society and Genetics.
All right, so thank you. Thanks again for being with us. So we decided to change things up a bit. So a few weeks ago, Marcy and I were talking about what to talk about on this panel, and we realized the conversation that we were having would probably be instructive for the group. And so we figured that it'd be good to kind of have more of a conversation among all four of us, and as opposed to individual presentations, just as a way to kind of get at the issues in a different way. So each of us work on different aspects of science and technology, but algorithms and the question of algorithmic fairness are not squarely in the wheelhouse of any of our work. So today we're going to draw upon our experiences and insights with regards to how race has been used and conceptualized in other technological spaces, and hopefully provide some insight on what this work might mean for the way that we think about machine learning and bias. So we're going to start off with each panelist. I'll introduce each panelist briefly, and each one of us will spend a few minutes just talking about how our existing work relates to the question of this meeting. So Marcy Darnovsky, Executive Director at Center for Genetics and Society. Marcy, you just want to talk for a few minutes about how the work that you do at CGS connects with the conversation we're having today?
Sure. Thank you, Osagie, and thanks to Pat and Cynthia for organizing and bringing us all together. So the Center for Genetics and Society is a nonprofit organization, a public interest organization. We're based here in Berkeley. We're just down the street on University Avenue. And I should say that some of our folks are here today. Katie and Catherine and Kayla and Osagie has been associated with the Center for Genetics and Society for a lot of years.
Long time.
So our mission is to bring a social justice and public interest perspective to assessing the social implications of a range of human biotechnologies. And by that, in that category, we include human genetic technologies, and we include assisted reproduction. And we think that this lens, this social justice, public interest, human rights lens will tell us some important things about how these technologies have been and should be developed, deployed, marketed, understood, and governed. So we do some policy advocacy work. We do a lot of communications work. And we have, over the years, tried to gather around us a network of scholars and public interest advocates from whom we have learned enormously and deeply, and many of them are in this room. So that's another kind of thanks that I need to give. So I'll say a couple more things and try to link to algorithms just in a couple minutes. So the mission that we have, this idea of bringing a social justice perspective to human biotechnologies, it seems to strike a lot of people as a really odd idea. And the idea that we should learn, and we can learn, from the histories, the social context, specifically the histories of scientific racism and eugenics, the social context of structural inequalities and racism. This idea is not one that's obvious to a lot of people. So part of our work is honestly just telling people that there is an important connection that should be made there. But I think, it is obvious to a lot of people. I think it became obvious to us because of the moment that we were founded, which is back in 2001. So this was the time just after the mapping of the human genome, a few years after Dolly the cloned sheep, and the controversies about human reproductive cloning and research cloning that came up around that. A few years, not that many years after the publication of the bell curve that we've talked about today, and the ongoing pushback against this pernicious ideas in that book. And also we were formed in the middle of a chapter of a almost now forgotten earlier chapter of controversy about the prospect of heritable genome modification. And that was one of the main motivations for founding a public interest organization to look at this range of technologies. So we know that, I'm sure everyone in this room has read the headlines of the babies in China, the CRISPR babies in China. Well, back then there was also a group of scientists, bioethicists, futurists, a small but vocal group who were very excited about the idea that we were now learning enough, now that we had mapped the human genome and had learned to read it, we were going to be able to rewrite it. So, so that's where we got our start. And as I mentioned that, we have been privileged and honored to work with scholars across a range of disciplines. Recently, more with life scientists than we have in the past, some of whom have reached out to us, but also sociologists, anthropologists, legal and policy experts, and also with a range of social justice advocates. So people whose work is not in the academy, but in communities, working on racial justice, reproductive justice, disability justice, and LGBTQ justice and rights. So just to mention a few of the areas of concern that cross more closely with the topics of today, we have actually tried to really do some work connecting the history of scientific racism and eugenics to the eugenic temptations that I think have hung over today, and to the racism that is embedded in a lot of biotechnology and biomedicine that we've talked about already today. So we've really tried to track this resurgence of ideas about racial classifications having some real basis in biology rather than being social constructions with a hierarchical assumption built into it. We've looked at the debates around race, genetics, and IQ. One phrase that I would like to bring into this conversation that I was surprised hasn't come up yet today is this idea of polygenic scores, the idea that you can have a single number that's going to predict educational attainment that's found in the genes, independent of society, history, economy. And then we've also worked on some of the specific applications of human biotechnologies, DNA forensics, and the very important racial implications of the disproportionate contact between communities of color and law enforcement, and how that is reflected in and shapes the way that DNA forensics are used. And one thing that didn't come up, but we have a lot of the experts who have looked at it in this room, the idea about race-specific medicines, something that we've tried to communicate to publics. And finally, the idea of ancestry tests. And again, a lot of the people in this room are people who have been on that for 10, 15 years, and the way that racial categories are implicated in these ancestry tests. So these are all things that are ways that data in databases, algorithms, the genome-wide association studies that are being turned into polygenic scores. We look at the way that these are translated into popular culture, into through the media, into political culture, and some of those are the kinds of things that I want to give you examples of later.
Great, thank you. So next we have Alondra Nelson, who is the president of the Social Science Research Council and professor of sociology at Columbia on her way to the Institute for Advanced Study. So if you could share a few thoughts with how your work connects with the theme of the conference.
Sure. Well, Marcy covered kind of the whole spectrum, I think, of what many of us have been doing for almost the last 15 years. But I would just add that, I think that the sort of moment of 21st century genetics in which you have the sort of marriage of, the eugenics temptation, one might call it, or that sort of longer history of genetics with supercomputing becomes a moment that necessitates algorithms because you've just got a lot more information. And so for I think many of us in this room have been working on genetics, the headline has never been algorithms or algorithmic bias, right? We've been actually talking about this work in a different way. But certainly over the last, even my earlier work about the late 20th century and about community activists was also about genetics to some extent. But tracing that work is really also tracing a kind of history of algorithms. And in my case, because I work with often local communities, or I'm interested in sort of how scientific ideas sort of travel on the ground, it's been also a kind of way. Another slice of it is sort of how local communities have been engaging with the sort of rise of algorithms as they come to have increasing social and political force.
Great. And next we have Aaron Panofsky, who's an associate professor at UCLA Institute for Society and Genetics, and also in public policy and sociology.
Thanks. First of all, I just want to say thank you for the invitation to come here. I think that this has been a really fascinating conversation. I think it's really important to have more conversations like this that try to cross disciplinary lines in a spirit of kind of like openness and exchange, where people are really interested in learning from each other. So I'll say one thing about the institution I work at, and then a little bit about my research. So I work at this place called the Institute for Society and Genetics at UCLA. It's different than the Center for Genetics and Society, right? So what we're essentially a department at UCLA, and we're very broadly interdisciplinary in that we have sociologists like me, historians of science, anthropologists of science and technology, but also primatologists, an epigeneticist who basically poisons little nematode worms and sees what happens to their future generations. We have a medical anthropologist. We have a science technology studies scholar coming in, and so forth. So we have and we have a scholar of race and religion. So we have this very sort of broad interdisciplinary group of people, and there are others that I didn't mention. But what I want to say is that what we're really trying to get at is how can you have a community that moves beyond the sort of intractable sort of poles of conversations about what inheritance or heredity means in society, right? We don't, have the nature people and the nurture people and have them duke it out. We try to have a sort of a broader conversation about different ways of framing these questions and problems. And the way we do this is, on the one hand, a huge amount of our time is devoted to figuring out like when we can have a common faculty meeting, right? Because like everyone has a joint appointment. Anyway, so that's the real problem with interdisciplinary exchange, is not actually the intellectual stuff. It's like, how can we find a common meeting time? But when we do talk about the intellectual stuff, we spend a lot of time talking about how do we educate our students, right? So we have an interdisciplinary major and minor. And I think this is the kind of thing, actually, that is really important to think about in an educational institution like Berkeley, in an institution that's trying to think about how do we sort of theorize computing and theorize artificial intelligence for the future, right? So how do we train students in a new way so it's not just, okay, all you're being trained in is the math. And then once you are a fully formed intellectual and competent in that, then maybe you can think about social issues when you go to a collective meeting, right? Can we start earlier on and to think about the entanglement and embeddedness of how, in our case, genetics and society, biology and society, biology history, different forms of inheritance, different forms of health, different definitions of structure, agency, things like that, how all that stuff can be embedded in ways of thinking about the problem of human health, human biology, and its social and ethical meaning. So that's one dimension of what we do. So we spend a lot of time trying to think about how to do that in teaching. And then actually, in some ways, a smaller portion of what we do is engage in collaborative research projects. And part of that is because it's difficult, you can't articulate a problem that is so interdisciplinary that brings that 10 list of scholars that I mentioned to you all into one problem area. But there's lots of binary and triples of people that are engaged in collaborations, apply for grants and things like that. But I think it's a really effective way of thinking about how can you move conversations forward that are not after all the research has been done, right? So hey, I made an algorithm and it can diagnose bias in this linguistic corpus. That's awesome. But how might that problem be transformed if the undergraduate research assistants and the undergrad and the graduate students and the postdocs and the scholars had been educated in a different train? That's not to be critical of the model and the efforts to try to confront this stuff as it is, but how might the transformation take place if we thought about education a little bit differently? So that's where we come from, and so it's a different way in which we're public facing than the Center for Society and Center for Genetics and Society is right. So I think we're trying to think about. One of the main ways we try to think about this is through an educational mission. I wish we were a little bit more public facing. I wish we had the sort of resources and wherewithal to do more of. Anyway, some public stuff, but the day is young. So and then let me talk for a second about my own research. And one thing that I want to. So I'm a sociologist of science, and I think a lot about how science gets made and under what conditions it gets made. And one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot in this conversation is we have sort of this implicit discussion about bias being like a problem that we need to solve. So let's debias our estimates or debias our corpuses and stuff. And I think one thing a theme that I keep coming back. Oh, and how do we be more, so debias, how do we make our research less ambiguous so we can be more precise about the sort of terms and the meanings that we use? This is some of the stuff that Evelyn was talking about in the database that she was talking about. And I guess the point that I keep coming back to in my research is the ways that bias and the ways that ambiguity are functional. And I don't necessarily mean in a good way, but that they serve positive functions for the authority of expert cultures. And some of this is because, the deep nature of something like race, so it's like Stuart Hall a long time ago, and even before this, but Stuart Hall a long time ago called race a floating or a sliding signifier, right? It's a thing that gains its power partly through its polysemy. It's our inability to pin it down, or anytime you pin it down one way, oh, did you mean this? That's bias. Oh, no, I didn't mean this. I meant this. Pin that down. Oh, no, we didn't mean this. We meant this, right? So there's a way in which it's ambiguity, the way it straddles between different sort of forms of meaning and different definitions, is part of what gives its power and authority. And so that's that's interesting, right? Because when we're doing things like machine learning, my sense is that what we're trying to do is disambiguate, make more solid connections, and so forth. Okay, and then in bias, I can tell you vignettes from my research later on, but the bias thing is that I think that actually, fields like behavioral genetics, fields like polygenic prediction, gain power in part by speaking in ways that are on the edge of improper and illegitimate. Improperly and illegitimately about race and racial differences, right? So it's not just, and this is people who have good hearts, right? This is not people who have malice in their heart. There are those people out there. Harriet talked about some of them. Evelyn talked about some of them, right? So there are the Charles Murrays, the Philip Rushtons, the Cartwrights back in history. But there are also people that now are, I think, on that, that they gain authority and power in their fields, partly by being willing to speak in ways about things like race and racial differences that touch on illegitimate claims about racial differences and intelligence and things like that. We can develop that more.
Great, thank you. And in terms of my own work, so I'm a professor of bioethics here at Berkeley in the Joint Medical Program and School of Public Health. So a lot of my work looks at the social, political, and historical context that gave rise to the field of bioethics in the mid-20th century, and understanding how the lessons we learned from that moment can be applied to contemporary concerns here in medicine and science. But with that, I'm also very much interested in how we can apply some of the lessons about the birth and growing pains of bioethics as applied to other fields in science and technology, including things such as machine learning. So being able to kind of draw connections and learn from one another, I think, is at least for me, a key part of my work. So for the next, how much time do we have?
Still something like 5:15, 5:20.
Okay, great. So we're just gonna have a conversation and talk about a few things that we find important, both in terms of our own work as applied to this conversation we're having now on algorithmic justice. And I think a good place to start is kind of where Aaron ended up in his statement. So how do we typically think about bias when talking about race and technologies? So what assumptions and frameworks are at play? And any of you can jump in on that?
I just blabbed for a long time, too long.
So I should just say that I'm have a lot of ire around bias conversation. I think it's the wrong conversation to be having about social inequality, about racial inequality more generally. I think there are lots of reasons why that as we talk about bias, it's either present or not present, rather than bias being something that's epiphenomenal. As we talk about bias, to Aaron's point, I think that it's easy to forget that it's not a system. The bias systems work to amplify powerful ends, and so that in some ways is often the intention of them, not the accident of them. Mm-hmm. I worry that particularly for machine learning, artificial intelligence, and other kinds of sophisticated systems, that we talk too much about bias as being a kind of 20th century racism, and that's not useful. So we get very caught up in things that drive me quite literally insane, like the viral video for the racist soap dispenser, don't care, right? I really don't care, and so we're stuck. We get caught in this sort of trap as bias as exclusion, or bias as it takes me longer to get soap, and it's a kind of anemic and not, I think, particularly either politically or intellectually useful way. So it's this kind of very anemic inclusion and diversity sort of paradigm for talking about machine learning and the implications of the algorithmic turn. And I think it also, as an analytic tool, as scholars of inequality, as scholars of race and technology, it also puts us in a way of talking about race that doesn't appreciate the dynamism of it and what it is in this moment. So one of my kind of examples, often when people are talking about class, we don't have a problem talking about the sort of ways that class has changed over time, or capitalism has changed over time from pre-industrial to neoliberal, and there's lots of other things in between that we'll talk about. But we have, I think, a challenge in talking about the dynamism of racial bias and racism. And for me, the way that we're talking about bias now is a hurdle. It's a sort of it's one of these moments in which we're not sort of saying, what is the moment in which we're living in, and how is the race of this moment and the racism and the bias of this moment different from moments that have preceded it? And I think we need to grapple with their question. There are things that are the same, right? The sort of issues around classification, issues around hierarchy, issues around notions of intellectual inferiority and superiority. Those things are evergreen, right? But there's also a way in which race is operating in racism differently now. One of the ways I think that we have to think about that is that it's systemic, right? And I think that if we're going to understand how bias works in algorithmic systems, we need to understand that it's not just the intentions of a one bad or good actor. It's not just the intentions of one good or one bad algorithm. It's how the actor and the algorithm moves around in a system and in a process. And so for me, for social scientists, what is a way of thinking about the world and about issues that arise vis-a-vis kind of machine learning, artificial intelligence, and the like that are systematic in scale, similar to the phenomena that we're studying, right? And that are dynamic in the way that they operate, right? And so the bias, again, for me is sort of present or not present. It's not like, someone makes a meteorological algorithm and it ends up being a predictive policing algorithm. Like, how do we get there? But that's true. That's where we, but like, it's not, and I think a lot of our conversation leads us to say like, oh, there was a really bad computer science engineer and it's, his or her fault. And that's why we've got bias in the system. All of the things that happen as we go from meteorology to predictive policing need to be part of a social science apparatus for thinking about bias, not just the kind of one actor, the one system, the one thing, the one moment. So that's what I would sort of offer. And that said, I think if we can think about bias in a systematic way, that it actually could be not only conceptually, but politically useful, right? So if you can show how a kind of supply chain of bias operates, whether or not it's intentional or unintentional, and how you go from sort of provenance to the use of, say, an algorithm, then it allows us to actually talk about the complexity of inequality as a response to that. So there's a case study I want us to talk through in addition, but I'll sort of stop there.
So let me tell you the like short version of that study I alluded to that I did about the field of behavioral genetics early on, and some of the ways that I think that bias, or what we might think of, what we might label now as bias, what others might label as racism, played a kind of functional role. Okay, so here's the story. So I wrote a book called Misbehaving Science, which is kind of historical and sociological account of the field of behavioral genetics. These are the guys who talk about genes for IQ, personality, criminality, and so forth. And so in one part of the study, I looked at the way that behavioral geneticists, this broad field of psychologists and geneticists and psychiatrists and others, dealt with people like Arthur Jensen. So he was this major G theorist and theorist of IQ, and set off in the early 70s the IQ debate, which was basically his string of reasoning was, everything from mouse studies to twin studies shows that IQ is heritable. Everything from our studies about education suggests that IQ can't be changed very much by educational interventions. We're talking, this is also written in 1969, so things have changed, but this argument. Everything shows that the black-white IQ gap is wide and enduring. And when we string all these things together, it suggests that the black-white IQ gap is genetically determined, and that therefore we're wasting our time and money and effort talking about things like, and this is literally what his conclusion was, things like Head Start, right? We should not be trying to do compensatory education because we're just throwing good money after bad, and we're not, if IQ is genetically determined and racial, and the reason is that African Americans are genetically less capable of learning and knowing, that's it, QED. And so he wrote about that, and then you have people like Philip Rushton, who wasn't mentioned, but he was another figure in this field. He had more provocative theories about the sort of evolutionary history of whites and blacks. This is penises, right? So he had an RK theory, which was about the the RK life history theory, do people know what this is? Right, so this is basically, do you have a strategy of having lots of, spreading lots of gametes into the world and not caring about them, or investing heavily in your offspring? And so are you like an elephant and you raise one baby for 6 years? Or are you like a sea urchin and you spread 10 million gametes every time and just like let it go that way, right? And so that's what sort of RK theory is trying to get at. And he sort of said, no, this explains racial behavioral differences, right? So you have whites and Asians who invest heavily in their babies and are very sexually responsible and civilizationally complex, and you have black people who are sexually promiscuous and don't invest in their babies and don't care about the intelligence of their babies, and so they have a different evolutionary history. And this is what explains the sort of civilizational differences between the three major three major races. Oh, and also he got to say that he wasn't racist because he ranked Asians above whites, so he wasn't a white supremacist anyway. Okay, anyway, so you get these guys saying this stuff. Crazy theories, totally flawed. You could just top to bottom talk about all the sort of flaws in this research. And so I interviewed a whole bunch of behavioral geneticists about, well, what do you think about these guys? And there were a couple others in this camp. And they said stuff like, oh man, first of all, like with Jensen, they said stuff like, well, he's brilliant. I don't know why he's so fixated on this race stuff. Like, if he just stuck with the IQ, if he just stuck with the twin studies, it'd be great. But he keeps bringing race into this. I don't know why he does that. And so it was sort of like, okay, so he's not, and they would say he's not a racist. He just doesn't have the kind of social sensors to know when something's inappropriate. So I was like, okay, so he's not a racist, he's just a sociopath, okay. So, and then with both of them, they would say stuff like, look, we just think that this is not good science, right? You can't, for lots of technical reasons and for lots of sort of sociological reasons, you can't make the kinds of claims that they want to make using the kinds of technical tools that we have as behavioral geneticists. So I won't go into that, but that would be the kind of thing I would hear again and again and again from the researchers. But, they would say, but we would defend to death his right to do this under principles of academic and intellectual freedom. And so that was a puzzle for me, because that's not what intellectual or academic freedom is, right? So academic freedom is the right to use science and proper and legitimate canons of scientific research and follow them where they go, not the right to say whatever the hell you want that everyone around you thinks is bad science and misuses their research for your sort of nefarious racist terms and calls that and implements that in your field. Does that make sense? I didn't explain that very well, right? But so, like that's what scientific freedom is supposed to be, right? Not defending the right to do bad science, defending the right to do good science, even if it leads to unwelcome conclusions.
Negative consequences if you do bad science.
Yes.
Right? That's part of academic freedom.
Yes, great, good point. Right. And so then they would talk about their defending academic freedom by defending his right to do that stuff, as opposed to defending their academic freedom by attacking bad science within their field, right? And so that was part of my question in this. So there's a long historical reason why that happens, but I wanted to talk about just some of the functional, symbolic reasons. Because when I talk to people about why, okay, so why do you sort of keep this race question in there, even if in the field, even if you don't think it's good science? There were three things they would talk about. One, they would talk about it allowed the legitimate behavioral geneticists to establish their reasonableness on the matter. Okay, so they would say, well, okay, so we have Jensen and Rushton on one side, but then you have like the flat earth social scientists and sociologists and anthropologists on the other side. And we occupy a kind of reasonable middle that says that a partial hereditarian hypothesis has some plausibility, theoretical plausibility, even if we don't have the sort of the empirical tools to measure it. Okay, so that was one thing. It allowed them to sort of signal their between two camps reasonableness. A second thing it would allow them to do is claim relevance, right? Like it's like this obscure stuff about like which of the 5-factor personality traits is heritable with twins, who cares? But this, race, that's something everything cares about. And so one of them talked to me about how like every time he goes to a cocktail party, the first thing people ask them is not about personality. They ask them, but just tell me, okay, so what's the race thing here, right? It gives them the relevance. They're always on the phone, right? The journalists always want a quote from them. It gives them a reason to be much more important than their sort of marginal and sort of problematic field, right, that's been criticized in all these different ways would otherwise be. And the third thing is it allows them to assert kind of strength and independence from their interlocutors, right? No, we're going to say, we're going to follow the truth where it goes, or we're not going to cow to the PC dictates of the academy, right? We are an independent, intellectually powerful, autonomous. We have our own judgment of what's important questions, right? So, and they would say, this is all the stuff that they said. So to me, what I realized was that they would defend something that they believed was false, basically, or unknowable, but it also served these other functions for them. And I think that is, so are there lessons here for us more broadly, right? Are there lessons for, I don't know. You know, so like just the other day in the New York Times, there was the whole thing about how YouTube keeps feeding pedophilia, right? You guys know this, right? Because it strings together a set of sort of innocuous videos about children playing and children in swimsuits and children gallivanting, and then after a while you're like, wait a minute, this is stringing together sort of so is that an error? Or is there something functional going on? Is there something beneficial going on for some logics in the company? Anyway, that's a provocative thing to say.
Yeah, maybe I'll do a slightly different take on this. Going back to the ancestry tests, and I was just gonna, please, can you, oh, there. You need to put in the password though, right? So, so I think it was really clear early on in the development of these ancestry tests that there was some serious, consequences here of talking about the fact that we're going to find ethnicity in our genes. And there was an article that came out way back in 2007 in Science that several of the authors are here with us. That was included Alondra and John Kahn and who else? Other people here were on the Joan Fujimura was on it, and Duena was on that paper, and Jay Kaufman. So this was a paper called The Science and Business of Genetic Ancestry Testing. Remember that? And one of the things they said was these tests should not be seen as determining the race or ethnicity of a test taker. They cannot pinpoint the place of origin or social affiliation of even one ancestor with exact certainty. And while the websites of many companies state that race is not genetically determined, the tests nevertheless promote the popular understanding that race is rooted in one's DNA. So it was clear from the beginning, right? But still, see if I can go forward to, we had people who were involved with this burgeoning industry, and it has continued to burgeon, and it, like even in the last few years, taken off in even a far greater way with a spike in the number of people whose DNA samples are now in these proprietary, private, for-profit databases. This is back in 2008, just a few months after the Science article I just quoted from came out. And it's Anne Wojcicki. She is the founder of 23andMe. She was married to Sergey Brin, one of the founders of Google. And she would talk about these issues of race. And here's the way she would talk about it. We envision a new type of community where people will come together around specific genotypes. And these artificial barriers of country and race will start to break down. So that was her promise and her intention. We can say that was what she truly believed, perhaps, and what motivated her. But then I think the question that I'm trying to get at here is, how are these ideas translated? The mandate of our panel was to look at translational issues. And so let's look at how these ideas are translated into what people have taken from the fact that they, for Father's Day, for Mother's Day, for, any day of any holiday you can think of, you get these barrages of advertising now on television, on radio, for these ancestry tests. And is it making people think that there is something biological, genetic, that defines race? Well, I think it does, and I think the companies, despite the claims on their websites that they've been making since 2007, and despite these kinds of statements, the companies sometimes slip up and they make it really clear. So I wanted to play this 30-second ad, if it'll play. Oops, nope, I want to go back. Does anyone know how to make this? This is an embedded video, and it played on my computer.
He's coming, he's coming.
So this is an ad. It's a 30-second ad that was all over television during the 2018 Winter Olympics. Yeah. It won't do that. Okay, so the website says, the ad shows this Olympic skater, and it talks about her greatness. And so the idea is, where does this greatness come from? And obviously the greatness comes from her genes, right? And so as the narration goes on, we see that her greatness not only comes in general from her genes, it comes 48% from her Scandinavian genes, and I can't remember which is which. Maybe the Scandinavian genes were the ones that gave her precision, and the Central Asian genes were the ones that gave her drive, and the British genes were the ones that gave her grace. But this is not subtle. So I think that this is the kind of translational issue we need to be grappling with, because when we look at how these ideas that are based on massive databases of genetic information, that they've got some data that shows them something, this is how it gets translated into popular ideas, and we can't necessarily blame it on the bad computer scientists, the bad database analyst, or even the bad co-founder of the genetic testing company. This is stuff that is so embedded in our society and in our ideas. But
why isn't it Ancestry's fault, the fact that they're showing this ad?
I'm sorry?
He's saying blame ancestry.
Blame ancestry. Blame ancestry. Well, I think this is a pretty dramatic example, and ancestry should be blamed and should be taken to task. And that's, something that we, in a small way, tried to do by publicizing this. But I think it's embedded in the entire industry. And I think what we're facing is new ways where ideas of genetic essentialism and race as biology are getting promoted with the imprimatur of cutting-edge science and technology. So that's a problem I think we face.
Great. So thank you to each of you. So I think it's useful to maybe switch gears a little bit and talk about specific technologies that we might have concerns about. So facial recognition is becoming an interesting space where algorithmic justice is interfacing with the public. So just a couple weeks ago, San Francisco banned the use of facial recognition technologies by the police department and a few other agencies. So Alondra, can you tell us a little bit about what happened at the Atlantic Park Towers?
Yeah. So this is a case study that I've been watching for a few months and that I hope that we can have a conversation about, in part because it reveals that the complexity of what we're dealing here is more, I think it is a bit more dynamic and complex, as I said before, than the issue of bias. So this is a case that's unfolding now in East New York, Brooklyn. As you said, it's the Atlantic Park Towers, which is a rent-regulated or rent-stabilized apartment in New York City, where there are decreasing, that's a decreasing pool of things. And the landlord for this unit proposed last summer to install effectively a facial algorithm, a facial recognition system for people to enter the building. So these were formerly, there's all sorts of things here, and I'll just lay out a few issues that I think get us beyond a very simplistic bias conversation and force us to actually really have a conversation about intersecting incentives and other kinds of contexts that are not only or solely about the technology or an algorithm. So these were formerly Mitchell-Lama apartments. They were formerly for middle-class people in New York City. The apartment, the sort of company that owns the apartment building had already been engaged in hyper-surveillance of this community, which is disproportionately African-American women senior citizens. So there was evidence that they were using cameras in the building to see what people were bringing in and out of their homes. So long before this became an issue about facial algorithms, they were using cameras to say, well, you're not supposed to have a space heater in your apartment, and our cameras sort of observed you having a space heater. So it's already a context of heightened racialized, gendered and classed kind of surveillance into which the facial recognition algorithm is being proposed to enter. So this is like, I kind of think the rub that I want us to talk about. I mean, so for me, we talk often about sort of AI and machine learning and sort of as mere abstractions. And as those of you who know my work know, I'm always interested in sort of the translational piece, which is about how non-experts sort of deal with this. So whether or not it's community activists in the 1970s or early adopting consumers of direct-to-consumer genetics and the early 21st century. So in this case, the activists have taken up the language of algorithmic bias, right? And so they say, as part of their challenge, so they're going to a state entity, a New York City body that has the authority to either grant this or block this, that the algorithms are biased, that we have seen reports and data coming out of MIT and otherwise that says that if you use these facial algorithm systems on us, they'll be biased against us, African-American women in particular, right? So that's, we know that to be true in some instances. We don't know that necessarily to be true of this particular system, which is called Stone Lock, which was developed particularly for various kinds of uses in real estate markets and housing. So the challenge here, of course, is that if you're Stone Lock, then you say, we're going to give you a more accurate algorithm, and we'll make sure you won't be misidentified by our facial recognition algorithm that we are still going to continue to use to allow you to get into your building. And I think that it creates that there's a kind of political vulnerability for vulnerable communities around the use of a bias claim because it is tied to a technological fix. And in this case, there's other issues of, as I said, pre-existing hyper-surveillance. There's issues of, this is East New York, which used to be sort of the quote-unquote badlands of New York City and of Brooklyn, which is now being rapidly gentrified, in part because they rezoned this area from being industrial to making it for residential real estate in 2016. So this is coming just on the heels, 2 years of a sort of radical rezoning. And so I feel like the bias conversation, which is like, again, goes back to this, like, we're not included in the database and so we're going to be misrecognized, is a kind of 20th century kind of civil rights trope that's not particularly efficacious for 21st century tactics of racism, which include algorithms and algorithmic tools, but also are nested in these kind of complex systems of racial dynamics in which they are not the sole driver or the only driver. So I just would love to kind of think about that example as a way that we can get beyond the sort of bias conversation, because I think in this instance, as much as one should feel, I think, pleased that citizens on the ground, likely, not highly educated, can understand that there have been these sort of critiques of algorithm and algorithmic biases, that they don't win the day for what they're trying to accomplish here. And I think part of, it falls to us as scholars partly to, I think, offer a more sophisticated rendering of what sort of the social implications of algorithms in the world, particularly for vulnerable communities.
So, Alondra, I really appreciate your call for us to move beyond bias. But I think one tension that might exist is the idea that all of modern civil rights literature and many legal conversations are centered around bias. Mm-hmm. So to the extent that we want to hold people accountable, and law is usually a tool for holding people accountable, how do we kind of manage the temptation to fall back on the traditional legal tools that are premised upon biased frameworks, while at the same time, as you're suggesting, have a more sophisticated framework for thinking about how these things are actually affecting people's lives? Do we just have to start over and have a kind of new generation of civil rights laws that are much more updated to the current challenges, or is there a way to manage this tension?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a legal scholar, and obviously, I mean, you and Jonathan can talk to this more, but you know, I mean, obviously the law builds on precedent, so, you know, you're kind of stuck with, you know, you got to dance with the one who brung you, or whatever that phrase is, right? You know, that's the kind of language, that's what you have to do. But I think even in the law, I mean, I think even civil rights law is not biased, right? You know, that's not the sort of lever on which civil rights claims operate, right? There's sort of disparate or not disparate intent. Sometimes there's issues of intentionality. Again, I'm saying this as someone who's not a legal scholar. And so I'm not even sure that bias is the right conceptual frame for talking about
Well, certainly
the law.
an individualist framework that is premised upon one bad actor doing something
Right.
horrible to another person, which kind of...
But it's typically in the law sort of discrimination, right? Or prejudice rather than bias, not just split hairs, but that bias is a rather, I think, new way that in some ways is evasive of the kind of issues that you're talking about that were core to civil rights.
So is it sort of that as long as the tool is equally discriminatory, equally captures and catches an appropriate and faithful representation or image of everybody, then the tool shouldn't be a problem?
I think that's the chess move that's left to people who latch themselves onto a bias argument.
Right.
And I think that's the catch-22 conceptually, theoretically, and politically that we're backing ourselves into.
Yeah.
Others have comments on this? Great. So,
Do you want to?
Yeah, why don't you say something?
oh, yeah.
I mean,
So,
you pose it as a question.
Yeah.
What's your take on it?
no, so I guess I would push your argument a little bit further.
Sure.
So my sense is that there are ways to kind of make distinctions between bias and discrimination and all these other things, but from my perspective, they are part of a nexus, a way of thinking about the adverse impact that certain frames of thinking can have on certain populations that is premised upon a very, as I was saying earlier, individualist framework of what discrimination is, as opposed to a much more structural approach, which seems to be the direction that you want to go in terms of how is it that we can have this kind of predictable adverse set of outcomes on certain populations in a way that occur despite whatever someone intends, right? And so, you know, I'm all for, you know, how do we rethink law in a way that is more aware and attuned to these broader structural conversations. And you know, people have been having these conversations in law for a long time, and have made some movement forward. But I think there's certainly room to have a much more extensive conversation about rethinking the way that law approaches the issue of how groups, in a sense, can become repeat losers because of these type of discriminatory attitudes. And so I would be happy to join you in that quest.
I mean, one way to think about it, I guess, is that, I mean, one thing that the law is doing better with regards to these algorithmic systems is, I mean, if you think about the wonderful ProPublica reporting on racial discrimination algorithms, if you think about Rebecca Wexler's great work on sort of unpacking the black box of sort of sentencing algorithms and these sorts of things. But I think that still sits on the forensic side and doesn't sit on the civil rights side, you know, so it would be interesting. So I guess what I'm, you know, it's not still clear to me. I'm still trying to think this through, but if we're going to use the law as an example, what would it mean to have an understanding of racial bias that allows us, in thinking about legal situations, to marry the piece around the black box of the forensic technology with the civil rights law piece? Do you know what I mean? As opposed to kind of thinking of those as discrete.
Aaron, Marcy, no? Okay, so one thing that Aaron talked about in his comments was this idea, and folks talked about earlier today, is this kind of the fuzziness of the category of race and race definitions. So just from your own point of view, why do we keep on using these categories whenever we all know that they don't really capture much, or at least they don't capture what we think they might be, they don't capture what we think they are speaking to?
So I can tell you about another paper that I wrote with Catherine Bliss, a sociologist at UCSF across the Bay. That was basically, it was a very similar kind of setup. So we were looking at articles in Nature Genetics over longitudinally, and we looked at just basically what are the labels, what are the population labels that are being used over time. And then we coded these labels into what is the kind of like ontology of belonging that they are referring to. So, and then roughly these collapsed into, is it a racial way of labeling a population? Is it a geographic way of labeling a population? Or is it an ethnic way, like a linguistic, ethnic, cultural way of labeling a population? And one of the things that has been commented on in multiple venues, but we found happen increasingly over time, is that geneticists are very happy to compare an apple to an orange to a blueberry. I mean, they're very happy to say, African Americans, we compared African Americans to people from Western Belgium, to Ashkenazi Jews, and to find out whether X, Y, Z, right? So there's this, or we compared people from this region, roughly, to people from this race, to people from this ethnic group, or, lots of different things like that. And so one thing we found is that as genetics became more of a population science, right? So over time, one thing that happens is more articles are about populations and the comparison of populations, as opposed to being about a gene and how it works or a set of molecular pathways, right? So molecular biology becomes less what nature genetics is about, and it's more about population genetics. But there's more of a tendency to combine and compare these different logics of what a population is in a particular study. And it's like kind of fundamentally kind of puzzling. So what are you actually comparing? What are you saying is genetic, right? What are you saying is typical of, like, what's a group? And this is happening at the same time as Joan was saying, like that these folks are claiming to be the science of population, right? They are the authoritative science about population. You want to jump in?
There's just a clarification.
Yeah.
How much, when you saw this, did it owe, do you think, to like the incompetence of the particular authors versus to, in terms of their willingness to compare an apple to an orange to a blueberry, versus comparing like cohorts that are collected by getting your hands on cohorts collected from very different people, each of them had their own way of categorizing, and then comparing them to
Yeah. Okay. So you're anticipating one of my results, right? So then we basically sort of documented this, and then we got interview data about what are you doing when you're trying to label these populations, and why are you doing this? So I think there are basically two findings. One was this opportunism, which is it's easier just to throw it all into a model and to collaborate with lots of different groups than to try to convince other groups that our ontology is correct, right? And so sometimes they'll say we really don't like it when they use Caucasian. We don't really, but they're in the criminal justice field. We're in the health field. We don't use that. But in the criminal justice field, that's the way everything's coded, and they think that that's the right way to do things. So it's better just to agree to disagree and get the publication out, right, rather than figure out what it is. That's one thing. Another thing is that they said that there are all these promulgated standards by these journals, okay, we should no longer use this kind of race. We should label in this way and this way, and a lot of them said, so NIH has rules about how you're supposed to collect and label your data. So do journals about how you disclose and describe things. And a lot of them were just screw the journals, screw the bureaucrats. This is partly we're claiming our authority to just sort of do our research the way we want, right? We're doing it in part to resist this imposition from others who are not scientists trying to tell us what a population is. And then a third thing was, so that was kind of an authority grab, but they also talked about not wanting to relabel populations, partly because of the politics of population genetics, and not telling people who they are, right? So they don't like to relabel, partly as an accountability measure to the populations that they're studying, they don't like to relabel those samples in different ways than what people tell them they are when they collect the data. Does that make sense? Right, and part of that, there's...
Just one other thing, it's just convenience and incompetence are not mutually
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Yes, right. And so I think that part of it, so there's this sort of like combination of different motives that are going on that kind of keep the wheels turning and allow, and then the last thing is that their favorite is to use continental labeling, continental labels. And this is the most ambiguous form of label because is it a geographic label or is it a racial label? And they liked to leave that undefined. So it's not just that they don't know and they don't know. So sometimes, this is something that Duana found, right? That when you ask them, well, what is race? They couldn't really tell you. So some of it is that they can't tell you, but some of it also is that they don't want to peel it back and actually make a statement about what it is. And it's better to use this kind of quasi-geographic, quasi-racial set of labels and combine them with others because it allows you to speak about race without speaking about race.
Somebody raised maybe it was you, Marcy, raised the issue of polygenic scores earlier. So with my SSRC hat on, with a colleague at Harvard, with Evelyn and two geneticists, we have, did a kind of closed workshop around polygenic scores, around the issues of racial classification, and a space of, I don't know if you call, what is our colleague Catherine Bliss calls it sociogenomics. You might call it sociobiology. There are lots of things you could call it. But these sort of research teams of social scientists, computer scientists, sometimes geneticists, who are using these big GWAS and genetic databases to, for some, it's actually just a math exploit or it's a statistical exploit, which is fine. But I guess the sort of challenge, I guess lots of things came up in these workshops. One of the things came up is that there have been a few papers around, important papers, New York Times front page above the fold papers on educational attainment and genetics that have come out, and these have been papers that are making claims about race, but the data set is the UK Biobank, right, which is not a racially, ethnically, continentally, whatever, diverse database.
And also excludes, or at least they exclude, non-white people.
Yeah, and moreover, I mean, one of the things...
purify the data.
Yes, but one of the things that came out in the conversations, the conversations were fascinating for so many reasons, because you had you had statisticians and people who were doing sort of bioinformation, and you had just sort of, sort of geneticists, and sort of no one could kind of, there was a lot of just noise and contestation around the methodology, which we as social scientists found very interesting. But one of the interesting things is that, literally in this data set, it distinguishes between like Sardinians and, like French or whatever. And so, but what's coming out of the back end are papers that say racial differences in X or Y, not like, the paper doesn't say like the differences between Sardinians and Greeks vis-a-vis blah, 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 right? And so there's also, this sort of easy move from a data set that's fairly, homogenous, right, to sort of fairly big claims about kind of racial differences and various kinds of social attributes. So that's, another way in which this works. And it's not just about sloppy conceptualization. It's also just really playing fast and loose with the data.
And just another translational issue here. And we try to. I think we're really interested in the way that these ideas that emerge from scholarship and from labs get translated into actual products that are sold to regular people, like the ones that we saw. Well, one of the things that's happening with polygenic scores now is, guess what? There's a company called Genomic Prediction. Is that right? Predictive Genomics. It's hard to get it right. And this is a company that is offering its service is that it will do genetic analysis of the embryos that you have created with your partner or your donor or gamete provider, and it will tell you what the polygenic score of each of the embryos is for educational attainment. So again, we're boiling it down to one number, and on that basis, we're going to just tell you which embryos you should not use to develop into your child. Now, the guy who runs this company, Stephen Su, who's the Dean of Research at Michigan State University, he says that for ethical reasons, they're not going to tell you which is the highest polygenic score embryo. They just want to tell you the low scoring embryos. So he does have some ethical standards.
Great. And so our last question before we take questions from the audience is, so what role can academic or public policy institutions play in bringing the correct framework on race and racism to developers of algorithms and to the public as a whole?
So this is actually a question that I'm actually really fascinated about with respect to this audience. Okay, so in this workshop that Alondra talked about, a lot of the geneticists, the population geneticists there, were extremely nervous about this idea of portability. So the idea was, can you take a polygenic prediction that's the training data is, say, the UK Biobank, and then can you transport that over to African Americans in the United States, or can you translate that over to Han Chinese? And so they showed us all sorts of very technical explanations for why you cannot do that, especially because of population stratification, basically genetic population stratification. So there's an interesting thing that has happened historically in the year that, I don't know, what has it been, 7 months since that thing. I think they all thought that the population stratification problem was going to get smaller and smaller and was going to be solved pretty soon, and what are we going to do about it? And I think it's turned out that the history's gone the other direction, that the population stratification problem has gotten bigger and bigger, and it's turned out that there's incredible amounts of population stratification even within ethnically homogeneous populations, so that, like, if you train the data on people that are 50 years old, it doesn't translate to the same population of people that are 20 years old, right? Like, so it's turning out that it might be the other direction, that actually population stratification is way worse rather than better. But, okay, so to those population geneticists, they're like, whew, I think that they're feeling like, okay, that means that we cannot make these kind of pernicious racial comparisons legitimately, and we don't have to worry as much about it. But the other thing is, there's no reason why you cannot calculate the polygenic risk score even on another population. And there are people in the field of behavioral genetics that are on the margins, as I was saying before, that have done so and have done a graph of, national population versus polygenic score, and they show that the African populations have low polygenic scores, and European populations have high polygenic scores, and Mediterranean populations are somewhere in the middle. QED, genes for racial superiority. And we're talking about the educational attainment data. It's not surprising that you would get that pattern as a complete artifact of population stratification. But there's no reason why you can't calculate it and plot it and then promulgate it. And this goes back to, and white nationalists have picked up on this stuff. Others have picked up on that stuff. And so, okay, and also these data are being, like, you can upload your 23andMe data to Spotify, or it's actually Ancestry data, to Spotify, and they will make a DNA playlist for you, or at least in the old days they would. I don't know if they still do it. I think they might have been some backlash.
Now they're telling you where to take your vacation.
Yeah, and they'll tell you to take, okay. So, okay, cool.
Yeah.
So now these data are available. So it may not be legitimate from the point of view of a Harvard or University of Chicago population geneticist to make these inferences. Great for them. But what about Spotify? What about just some machine learning scientist who's not a population geneticist? What about economists? What about others, right? So, like, what about the folks that, like, you can do it, you can calculate it, so what do we do? So what are the, like, I don't know, how do we prevent misuses when you can simply just, like, run it through a machine and get your outputs? And make business sense to do so.
Well, I think This is such an important question for the folks here. I mean, the folks here who come from the computer sciences, the life sciences, and who are sitting here all day talking about these social issues and issues of racial justice and issues of racism and structural inequality. You're the ones that care and about this stuff. And then, you know, one of the important messages, it seems to me, is that we just have to acknowledge, and we have to have people who do this in their daily lives acknowledge that science exists within these social structures, within these relationships of power and hierarchy. And that single point, I think, if more people really digested that, I think we would be so much further ahead in being able to use these tools in liberatory ways rather than oppressive ways. And it runs up against something really strong that's going on in our political sphere right now, which is the idea that when we talk about science being politicized, that's a bad thing. And the only people who politicize science are the right-wingers. So, you know, I take my dog around the block, and every other house has the sign that says, you know, in this house, everyone is welcome, Black Lives Matter, and science is real. What does that mean? You know? But that has really become a kind of a mantra of liberal and progressive politics right now, and it makes me so uncomfortable. And I feel like we need a way of talking about that, that, you know, acknowledges the attacks from the right wing. They are real and they are awful, but doesn't take refuge, just like, you know, the 20th century version of bias, you know, being the bad people. This is some, I don't know, Enlightenment idea, simple fairy tale about the Enlightenment, and everything about the Enlightenment is great, and I think it underlies a lot of the problems that we have in talking about these things that we're talking about today.
Okay, great. Any other comments on this? No? Okay, great. So I think we have a few minutes for questions from the audience. Evelyn, I know your hand up was earlier. Did you want to raise a question?
I think the polygenic, I just got me, I can't talk.
All right.
Nancy.
Fair enough. Okay, should I just call on people, or? Okay. All right, Nancy?
Real time, 15, 20 minutes. Go for it.
Just really short, because I know I've spoken before, but I want to really follow up on your point, Marcy, and especially in relation to this whole panel, which has been really useful to hear, which is, I think it is critical to be aware that there is science meant as a field of work, which is independent researchers independently testing ideas, but the question is which ideas premised on what frameworks. And the long history of scientific racism means that's as much a part of the history of what science as anti-racist science. And so therefore need to be clear on what the assumptions are. And I completely agree with your concerns of just saying science is real isn't enough. And I've been concerned about some of the mobilizing that's been happening around marches for science in that kind of way, and the questions that were coming up before as to who has authority or not. So at the this coming American Public Health Association meeting, the Spirit of 1848 caucus, which for those of you not familiar, we link issues of social justice and public health, and have been doing it. We're actually having our 25th anniversary. The whole frame is around what does it mean to be for science now, and it's actually about taking on anti-racist and anti-colonial science, and that's through the forms of both social history of science, but also progressive pedagogy, but also the politics of public health data. So I think that's really crucial of how do we talk about doing critical science without throwing science out the window and saying it's just all a matter of stories and anybody's story is as good as anybody else's story, because that's not so helpful either. And so but I think this is really important, and I think, Alondra, to your point related to this, is that it's really important, again, to historicize the moments that we're in. So it's different in the world of racial discrimination. There's not the laws that are being passed right now saying it's okay to legally discriminate as there are, for example, around LGBTQ stuff. So you're going to have moments where it's the actual legal policies that are under context, and you can look at how that's affecting the different health outcomes. But bringing in that historical framework about what's embodied and the continued impact of the historical redlining and the continued impact of Jim Crow, for example, that's really relevant. And I think my sense is that a lot of people in the here and now think that was all a long time ago and it's no longer relevant to understanding the current conditions. And I remember vividly one conversation with one political scientist was like, well, we all know race isn't a real category, so let's get rid of it and we'll just be fine. And I'm like, imagine you waved a magic wand right now, and all of a sudden, all forms of inequity were gone, except everybody was still in their same bodies. Does it not matter? It would still matter in terms of the health outcomes. It would still matter in terms of the services needed. It would still matter in the way that what matters for the next generation. So I think bringing that historical awareness of the moment of now in the context of really real bodies in which we live our lives and express the conditions in which we've grown up and which will continue going forward is really important.
Yes. So.
Thank you. I just wanted to build on what Nancy was saying. And Alondra, I so appreciated your message to us, because I do think these issues are very much go much, much deeper than separating out bad science from good science, the right uses of science from the misuses of science, and so on. So you brought us to the fact that it's not a matter of algorithms or bias, but algorithms are racialized by the very structures of which how society operates, like everything else. And I'm very reminded at this moment, I haven't seen Evelyn for 25 years or something like that. We were trying to figure it out. But it feels to me very much like conversations we were having decades ago when we were talking about feminist science studies and the ways in which it was very important to come up with new and usable ideas of objectivity where, just to bring back in some of the conversation also from earlier this afternoon, what Jonathan's point, not so much about having science tell the law about whether we should do affirmative action or not, but showing that from the get-go there are always operative assumptions just in stating a fact, and that something like, affirmative action is necessary for surfacing the assumptions that are otherwise dormant and doing their work. And that I do think that there is a way very much to talk about the kinds of alternative notions of objectivity within, for example, feminist epistemologies, which can really address things like your concern, Marcy, and the concern that Nancy was also raising about the ways in which, at a moment of time like this, we want to both say yes to science, but not to science as usual, right? Yes to science, and let's really push on the science as well, because this can be a moment for radicalizing science, or at least I'd like to think so.
Yes.
Since this is the policy section, I just wanted to ask, given everything we've seen today, like all the ways in which algorithms do bad things, but also even that we're here in the Bay Area where, you have companies come and not really have a sense of how they're hurting a community as opposed to helping the community that they're implanting themselves in, or whether we give all these apps that their goal is to disrupt, but not ask who they're disrupting or which communities they're disrupting or in what ways they're disrupting. I just want to ask, it feels a lot with all of these algorithms and apps and all these technologies that we're kind of in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution again, before we got all the regulations. Before we said, hey, child labor isn't so good, neither is monopolies and so on. So I want to ask, are there general regulations that we should start thinking of for these technologies, and especially for this audience? what definitions do you need from us theoretical computer scientists, and just the theoretical foundations of algorithmic fairness. What kind of definitions would you need to have well-defined regulations that are general as opposed to attacking each software engineering team and each company one by one and calling them out?
Any responses?
It's a tall order, yeah.
Let's have another workshop.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, one thing.
I think,
I'm sorry.
I love that question. I mean, I think that, it's so look, we've had sort of other moments of kind of high technocracy and high bureaucracy, but it is very much a moment for computer scientists to lead in the policy space. I mean, so I write about health activists who, in the late 60s and early 70s, who were engaged in health activism around genetics issues. And that was a moment in which people with non-experts could engage conversations about genetic science. I feel, we are in, planting a flag around Jonathan's conversation about battling expertise earlier today, and a moment of kind of very elite sort of technological policy making and technological apparatuses that very few people have access to, including a lot of very smart people with PhDs in this room who are not CS folks, right? And so it really, it falls, I think a lot falls on the CS community to, we can understand sort of conceptually, operationally, what's happening around classification and choosing categories and kind of basic things around algorithms, but to get to the meat of algorithmic systems that are impacting policies takes a level of expertise that fewer and fewer people have.
Mm-hmm.
So.
I mean, for myself, as someone who studies bioethics, part of the reason why I do the work that I do is because, the field of bioethics emerged in response to a recognition that one of the most horrific moments in human history was facilitated because of a lack of oversight of science and technology. And the field emerged in part to say, never again, that we're going to kind of have some type of professional oversight to make sure that there are certain rules and guidelines that we have to make sure that these type of outcomes don't happen. And fast forward several decades, we see a similar type of lack of regulation and oversight, not only in the fields of science and medicine, but in these other areas of technology that can produce similarly catastrophic outcomes. And so the question you're asking is, where's the oversight? And quite frankly, we're all asleep at the wheel on this. And part of the work that I try to do and advocate is that we need many more people participating in the conversation, not just as specialists, not just people with PhDs, but a much more a process that is inclusive in a democratic sense, to make sure, as you were saying, that the people who may be affected by this are part of the conversation, so that these technologies can develop in a way that can support and improve human life and not take away from it.
Okay, I just want to add one last thing, which is I think what's also really important to think about is the sort of political imaginaries that are animating the impulses to produce things and to think about how we would regulate them. So one thing is that I think that a lot of the terms that we use to discuss these things, privacy, individual autonomy, and so forth, not that I'm against privacy, but I'm not sure that it's a covering principle that actually gets everything we need. I think that this is one of the conversations that's been happening in bioethics, for example, is that so on the one hand, the sort of the dimensions of like individual autonomy, informed consent, and so forth are great, but they're limited, right? And we need to expand those out. But I also think that one thing that's happening right now is that there's a battle in the Silicon Valley more broadly between a libertarian imaginary, right, which is that fundamentally, oversight and regulation are bad, breaking things and asking for forgiveness, not for permission, and that there's no one more competent than us. So why should we have any accountability to anyone else? That's one imaginary. And then I think that's partly generational, partly not, partly distributed throughout, but I think that there are other imaginaries, right, which is a social justice imaginary, a socialist imaginary, others that might be fighting with that. And so anyway, I just think it's important for us, before we even think about like what are the regulations, but what are the regulatory imaginaries? And this links to, I think, things that, that, anyway.
Just to build one more brick on those comments, we get a lot of calls at the Center for Genetics and Society from reporters who want to talk to us about what's wrong with genetic databases of various kinds. Katie takes a lot of these calls. And we've had this conversation where we really want to talk to them about the sort of structural issues that come up around race and how the ancestry tests and how the 23s and me's are incriminated in those kinds of issues and in feeding these resurgent ideas that race is genetic and race is biological. And they want to talk about privacy concerns, So it really is a shift that needs to happen.
I've been trying to ask a question for quite a while now, and you keep calling on your friends.
What?
So go ahead and call on her or whatever. No, I'm just saying, this is a pattern. You keep calling on the same people you know, and other people are not given a chance to speak. I don't know if this is intentional, but you seem to know the names of everybody you call on, pretty much. Please go ahead.
Why don't you ask a question? Ask a question.
I'd love to ask a question.
That is not acceptable. I'm sorry. No. And I'm not one to usually try to make a point, but I'm sorry I have to call that out.
Yeah. He was actually also over there with his hand up for about 10 minutes and wasn't called on it.
And then I thought,
and sometimes it just happens. Sometimes it just happens.
All right, please ask your question.
Okay. Quick question. The war we're fighting right now is political and economic. And we will not win it unless science stops trying to defend science and starts trying to defend the people who are now being poisoned and otherwise suffering. Can you say something more about how your expertise might be used to change policy, because we need to change governance? Thank you.
I mean, I think that, so the one thing that I could say is that I think that part of what we want to do is combine different forms of expertise to disrupt the ordinary ways, things that Nancy was saying earlier about defending science, right, as an abstract thing, and that Marcy was saying, right, that science is an autonomous thing that it needs to be kowtowed to and honored, right? So part of, I think, what we're doing here today, and I think in other venues like this, is to think about how to disrupt that idea that science has its own logic or internal coherence, that it needs to be just respected, but that it's embedded and entangled in all sorts of other social relations. And so I don't know, that's the way that I think about what we can do here, rather than giving a sort of set of regulatory principles, starting a conversation about how to entangle different forms of expertise in different sets of imaginaries, as I was saying before.
I wanted to pick up on some of the questions about language and terminology and like frames. And you were talking about ethics and kind of asleep at the wheel. Bioethics seems to have gotten an enormous amount of traction within the people who practice medicine, healthcare generally. And it's been very interesting as somebody I practice in, I'm a lawyer, but I make a lot of common cause with people who think about values and technical design. Mm-hmm. And they are, the computer ethicists don't seem to have kind of gotten as embraced or embedded in the technical disciplines. But it's been super interesting to see the theoreticians, and I would say the computer science field more generally, embrace concepts like privacy. They define them in particular ways that may or may not fully embrace what we're looking at, or embrace an issue like fairness and come right all of these definitions. And for me as a lawyer, I think often in terms of human rights, and that seems to right now in much of the Silicon Valley being kind of displaced by a conversation about ethics, which for me, in fact, makes me very uncomfortable because I think it's a shift away from accountability and to a level of kind of ambiguity about what right outcomes are. I think ethics suggests that, well, we're all trying to do the right thing. We just have different frames where the language of human rights has a much more kind of accountability and a very legalistic framing. So I was just interested in the community's kind of reflections on what are the right terms to be using. Like you, bias, I'm more interested in justice. I think it takes the frame from, is it about a better algorithm or is it about systematic surveillance? I actually view bias and facial recognition algorithms as a bonus, right? And so I just wanted to hear you talk a little bit more about the words that we're choosing and how they relate to the frames that we might think about and how those in themselves suggest different kinds of mediations.
So I'll just say that, so the story about bioethics is not necessarily a happy one. And just to keep my comments short, I think there have been several people writing about this, including folks like Carl Elliott wrote a great book called White Coat, Black Hat, or other way around, Black Hat, White Coat, which tells a story about a field that emerged in the mid-20th century to be a check on the life sciences, but then fast forward a few decades and actually became complicit in some of the horrific things that folks in life sciences were doing. And I think the concern when we look at other technologies is that a similar pattern might emerge, whereas we have an important conversation about regulating industry and industry, and then things get messy, and all of a sudden the folks who are supposed to be overseeing things become complicit in the development of technologies that can be quite harmful. So part of this conversation is how do we kind of make sure that the effort at oversight is meaningful, substantive, and long-lasting, and separate from the folks who are actually doing development. I mean, there always has to be a relationship, but making sure there's a level of separation. But I think your question about, I think ultimately the second part of your question about what are our values? Is it bias? Is it justice? I think that's a critical conversation to have. But again, that can't just be a conversation that happens in the boardrooms of certain corporations. It has to be a public, democratic conversation.
And the frameworks and the terms do matter. So bioethics really has come to mean to focus on relationships, one-to-one relationships, or one-to-small group relationships. So it's the patients and the doctor. It's the research subjects and the researcher. And so you have, focus on informed consent and autonomy. But you don't have focus on structures, on social structures and on social justice and on and human rights, with a claim to be have some universal things to say about that, rather than just, I'm trying to be an ethical person.
Just very simply, I think one thing, ethics is about inputs or right actions. Justice is about outputs or outcomes. And we often talk about, well, if you act right, if you're ethical in your actions.
We think about procedural justice, right?
Yeah. Okay. But anyways, I feel like the justice framework is more, and I think that is justice is something that bioethicists say is a value, but they're not very good at articulating it.
Or operationalizing
it.
Yeah.
I just want to add one thing, which is that bias, fairness, ethics have been, words we've used forever, but have become very powerful in taking up a certain kind of space right now. So just from a political perspective, it begs the question about whether or not, even though it's it's what some of us mean, is justice the best vocabulary for shifting a discourse away from bias and ethics? So I don't know what the answer to that is, but it's worth kind of, I think, for us thinking about a new vocabulary that can sort of shift the conversation from bias and ethics that have really taken up all of the space.
So how much time do we have?
What do you think? Well, shall we take? So we have a reception that started 15 minutes ago, and was to go until 6:20. So why don't we take till say 10:15 or 10?
Okay. So one thing I think would be useful is, I like to always make sure if there are graduate students or undergraduates in the audience, if they have a question, make sure there's space for them to ask that question. So any students? you have a comment or a question? Sure.
I guess I just want to respond to the kind of comparison on language. I work in...
Mike.
Oh, sorry. I just want to respond or offer a comment or a perspective on the question on language, because I'm thinking about this a lot. I'm in philosophy and math, and I think when you say human rights, if you read Sam Moyn's History of Human Rights, that's a strong indictment of the term. And so there you have human rights taking up, kind of taking up the mantle, like a kind of weak mantle of justice after the, falling away of maximalist visions of global justice with the new international economic order. And so there, when I hear human rights, I'm like, that's not the language you want to use. And in my kind of like interest in political philosophy, what we want, at least what I'm interested in, is like the actual reclaiming of moral language in a space in which neoliberalism has largely evacuated out moral language from moving kind of everything from everything from a political register to an economic register. So what do we actually give up when we say that there isn't fundamentally some political capacity in our languages? And I think conversations about language are important because they're conversations about strategy, but they're not conversations, I think, about the intrinsic value of concepts, because then we're left in thinking that if we kind of just choose the right language, then we're going to kind of not do the political agitation. And I just think that that's also kind of itself a wrong strategy. So there's kind of a meta strategy level, there's like a strategy level at language, there's like a meta strategy level about what to do about the vacuum of language and what to do about dominant language that just like happens to be there genealogically and happens to be more communicated, and how we're all still like operating in our own positionalities about which language is more powerful.
That's great. That's really helpful.
Yes, in the back. Yes.
I was just going to say, to your point, we have a lot of projects in artificial intelligence, like AI for good. We don't really say like banking for good. Like even the words themselves have an association. Like the work we saw earlier. What are the adjectives that you have to add? How do you describe someone? And AI, even though it's a totally expansive word, idea, but we can't tell you what it is and what it isn't. So we have to add a value, because part of its power is this disjoint between what it is, how can we communicate about it translationally, and what the uses are. So as an AI natural language processing research scientist, I get very concerned when I see AI for good, the same way you see science is here. Yeah. What does that mean? Can they not be? Is the concept too big to also include ethical reasoning?
Yes.
Thank you. This is a question for all of the panelists, and thank you for a really rich discussion. So Alondra's kind of asking us to think beyond bias, I think, of course, is really important. I love the last comment from the student over here. I guess one of the shared issues I see between genomics and the data sciences, or what I would call the algorithmic turn, is the question of informed consent. And I'm wondering if, Shoshana Zuboff's work on surveillance capitalism and the way she poses decision rights actually helps us shift a semantic field in the direction of thinking about, it's not our right to say that we opt into facial recognition technology, but that we learn to recognize what's being performed upon us without our consent and often against our will, and also what is being extracted from us. So I think especially in the fields of genomics, you can sign up for UNME 23, but that information is being accessed by third, fourth, and fifth parties. And I also thought the comment in the back, I think from the CS student, what are you asking us for in terms of thinking about regulations? It is like this new moment that is akin to industrial capital, where there is rampant unregulation. Yeah. And I think the regulation question was so important. Yeah. So if any of you could reflect on some small part of it, would be wonderful.
I would offer one. This is with my Social Science Research Council hat on. Part of why I have to leave in a few minutes is I have to go. We've been working on a project that's trying to create a systematic pathway for social researchers to study Facebook data. And one of the things that's been fascinating in this project is that all of the projects that come to us for peer review are either exempted or mostly exempted or expedited from peer review, right? And so, the regulatory framework, even for the ethics of the research we do, is completely lagged/failed, right? So, we have created as a condition of the work that everything has to go through IRB or its international equivalent. Everything comes in expedited, right? There are no human subjects here. There are no human or public harms. There's no what. So the IRB is like, why are you even sending this to us? Like, why, here's your letter and apply for the data. So as an organization, we've kind of created our own internal kind of ethics review process. But I think to the point around bioethics, it's not only about sort of how do we get more kind of harness surveillance capitalism regulations. It's also about our sort of lack of courage and therefore lag around regulation that we think that we have, right? And it's also the case that part of what the algorithmic turn brings is a move to network and collective harms. And so the model of bioethics, which as Marcy was saying, is very much about the individual relationships between actors in clinical spaces and other things, don't apply. I mean, any genetic ancestry test is about you and anybody bio-related to you, by design. There's nothing you can do about that. So, we're in and I guess in this is what, to Karen's point, I mean, I think your work is kind of an example of what I'm talking about. I mean, we've got to get, I think, out of our way, and the fact that your work, which was like, there are objects, there's materiality, and people were like, that's radical, let's, go with that as a feminist, epistemology. It was like, I think we're facing another moment like that around, kind of racial politics and kind of issues of justice with regards to the algorithmic turn. And so I would offer, I'd agree with you, but offer your own work as in a prior moment, as a kind of another moment that we need to have. So I don't know if those are just some riffs on that.
Yeah, and with a advocacy hat on, I mean, we also really need the advocacy groups to take on these questions. Some of them to, emerge, like, the Science for the People group, that was the radical science group in the 1970s, is just relaunching the magazine. And I don't know that much about it, but I thought it was a good sign. But we also need to work with the existing advocacy groups across the range of sectors and really bring these questions, because I think those are the people that get it in their gut, that, these are questions about what kind of world are we building? What kind of future do we want to live in? That's really what we're asking here.
So about the comment about computer scientists kind of leading or being involved in these kind of regulations, and I think there's a lot of openness by certainly my community, which is theoretical computer scientists, towards being part of this kind of endeavor. And we understand the limitation of what we can do, and we understand the multidisciplinary nature of that. But I think we're at times getting kind of these mixed signals from various other communities that we are trying to collaborate with, where there is a lot of suspicion towards what we do and what we can do and what we can offer. Suspicion that kind of goes into these words like math. Math cannot do that, math cannot do that. And suspicion about, so not a suspicion towards a particular approach that we're suggesting, but a suspicion about our entire toolbox and what it can do, and its limitations that we are aware of, but we still feel as an important role to play in this. So our fight is not only towards the practitioners of the engineers, the companies, but also towards the communities with which we want to collaborate.
So it's a hand, so I guess we have so Larry? Oh, yeah, sorry. Okay.
My turn. Thank you. This may be an unfair question at the end of the day, but to bring it back to translation, this has been extremely informative for me about how new technologies, the algorithms, et cetera, are reinscribing old ideas of race as innate biology. But what we haven't done is talk about how we can rupture that discourse, what perhaps are the key scientific ideas and evidence that would be persuasive to a general audience, to the general public, because that could have an equal amount of weight, if hopefully more, in bringing back, in suturing together a new discourse which looks around human diversity.
Maybe a
Care
good
to comment?
That's a great idea.
So should we just, since we,
Let's get the list.
yeah. So should we just collect a series of questions all at once?
Comments and then.
You see somebody over there.
There's a couple folks over here in the corner.
One over here, and I think we should then go and have wine.
Okay.
Okay, I know I'm the last thing between you and wine, so I'll be brief.
Go ahead, and then there was one over here.
Go ahead. I'll more recently brief. I just wanted to circle back for a minute to the discussion around semantics and bioethics. I do a lot of work in that area, semantics and bioethics, and I think it's really important to point out that informed consent is something we assume we're entitled to in this country, but it's been eroded at an escalating pace. We're losing it. And the right to informed consent is being replaced in a way that's being catalyzed by semantic changes. Bioethics is now engaged with a type of newspeak, to the point where we have all these types of consent that have no element of consent. Deferred consent, consent after the fact. They say consent, but they don't involve you actually giving your right to say yes or no to anything. Since 1996, when the law was first changed to allow medical research with unconscious patients without their consent, we've been seeing this escalating a lot, and language has a lot to do with it. Last year, when certain words were banned, 7 words were banned by medical researchers, those words are quite significant. They reflect a bias, they reflect a point of view, and they are crippling in researchers' abilities to even ask certain questions. So I think it's really important to, when we think about bioethics, to understand that the words that sound so noble, that everybody agrees are good things, are often impotent. Everyone's for fairness, for example, but what is fairness? It means nothing unless you have actually defined it and enforced it, and that's not happening increasingly often. That's all I wanted to say.
So someone who looks for definitions, can you help with that? I'm serious. We have to talk.
Yeah, absolutely. I've done a piece on it. I'll send you.
Last one.
All right, last one. This is a really specific and pointed question because you're the policy people. So devices, medical devices are regulated. The government regulates them, right? Doctors are a self-regulating body. If a doctor does something and a patient dies, groups of doctors meet up and decide if that doctor did the right or wrong thing, right? So where do you see some of these things we've been talking about, right? This border of machine learning, is it a device? Is it approximating a doctor? Where do you see the regulation of that? And I think specifically coming from a bioethics background, where would you want to see that versus where do you think it's going to end up?
Yeah.
Should we license you?
I don't think we want to, I don't think there's the same relationship between, the designer of the relational database model and what those databases are used for today, that as there is between a doctor who violates her code of ethics in the way that her patient is treated. I think it's a different kind of relationship. So I don't think that there's, there's an easy translation there. I think that some of the gaps in the way that we regulate biomedical innovation are telling and are more like what the problems we face in the world of computer science and algorithms are. So for example, medical devices are regulated as to their safety and efficacy, but questions about social consequences and effects, certainly ethics and values, those questions are not considered in any kind of regulatory oversight right now in the United States. In other countries, there are some little ways you can, smush those questions in. But here, the FDA by law may not consider anything beyond safety and efficacy. And once the device or the drug is out in the world, then it's in the doctor's bailiwick, and the doctors can use it off-label. So some of the problems that we have in the biomedical sphere come out of that. And, that's what's going on now in the computer world. The technologies exist. They've been let out in the world. They are making gobs of money for some companies and individuals. And, we didn't envision it any more than we envisioned when we took the first barrel of oil out of the ground with an oil well. We didn't envision, a network of highways and lost luggage at the airport, and certainly not catastrophic climate change. But we have to get better at that. I think that's one of the points. We really have to get better at looking at the trajectory of these powerful, powerful technologies, and where is it taking us as societies and different ones among us in the stratified societies that we live in. We have to get better at asking those questions and steering things the way we believe they should go.
And I'll just speak very precisely. I think that actually we're in a moment of transition. I think 23andMe has just actually broken the sort of regulatory idea about what a predictive algorithm is, right? I mean, I think, I don't remember, what was it, about 4 years ago when 23andMe, 3 years ago when 23andMe was given a kind of cease and desist from the FDA, saying you are marketing a medical device and you need to stop doing that. And they appealed that, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And now, basically, it seems like I think they convinced the FDA, partly through a kind of hands-off regulatory regime that's been sort of introduced, that algorithmic prediction of health outcomes is not a medical device. It's not like an X-ray. It's not like other things. And so you can do it. And so, so I think that they basically had a decision made, and basically that gave a lot of freedom that's going to, my sense is it's going to establish a precedent that allows a lot of freedom for algorithmic prediction in the medical space. So watch out.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.